Welcome to Geopolitics Unplugged with your host, Justin James McShane, and co-host Glenda Rice. Be sure to subscribe, like, and share to help fuel us to produce more content for you all.
All right, so today we are going to do a deep dive into space militarization.
Yeah.
We've gotten a lot of requests to look into this, and we have a ton of articles and reports.
Right. And it's really timely, especially with all the rising tension between the U.S. and Russia and the U.S. and China.
Yeah.
And it seems like, space, which we used to think of as this peaceful frontier for exploration,
Right.
could actually become like the next big battleground.
Yeah, well, and, I was actually really surprised to learn that space militarization really goes back to, like, the beginning of the Cold War.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, with that initial space race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Yeah. I mean, when everyone was so focused on, who was going to get to the moon first,
Yeah.
both of these superpowers were also actively exploring the military uses of space and early satellites.
Yeah.
They weren't just for, scientific discovery. They were
Right.
often spy tools,
Yeah.
gathering intelligence on each other.
Like a whole spy thriller happening right above our heads.
Yeah, absolutely.
And get this, the U.S. actually had an operational anti-satellite system, or ASAT system, way back in 1960.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of crazy to think that the seeds of space warfare were being sown, like, right when we were taking our first steps into space.
Yeah, it really is. It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're embarking on this amazing adventure of space exploration,
Right.
but there's also this underlying, military rivalry
Right.
and potential for conflict.
Yeah, and fast forward to today, and it seems like those seeds have definitely sprouted.
Yeah.
I mean, we're hearing a lot more about ASATs and, electronic warfare in space and the possibility of an actual conflict erupting, above the Earth's atmosphere.
Yeah.
So, like, what are the specific dangers here?
Well, I think one of the biggest concerns is the sheer destructive power of these ASAT weapons.
Okay.
They're designed to disable or destroy satellites.
Like,
And, a single successful attack could have catastrophic consequences.
Yeah.
Imagine like a critical communications satellite getting knocked out.
Right.
That could disrupt global communications, financial transactions,
Yeah.
even military operations.
Yeah, that's a really scary thought because we rely so much on satellites for our everyday lives.
Exactly.
GPS, weather forecasting. I mean, even streaming our favorite shows. So, like, a conflict in space
Yeah,
could disrupt all of that
absolutely.
in ways that we can't even imagine.
It could affect everything.
Wow.
And then you've got the issue of space debris.
Yeah.
Every time an ASAT weapon is tested or used,
Right.
it generates thousands of pieces of debris that can stay in orbit for decades,
Yeah.
posing a hazard to other satellites and spacecraft. It's like this
Perfect.
domino effect,
Yeah.
One collision can trigger a cascade of others and
Right.
potentially lead to what's known as the Kessler syndrome.
The Kessler syndrome. I've heard of that, but
Yeah.
could you break it down for us?
Yeah.
What makes it so dangerous?
So imagine a scenario where there's so much debris in orbit that it starts to trigger this chain reaction of collisions.
Right.
And it creates this dense cloud of junk
Yeah.
that basically makes space unusable.
Oh, yeah.
Satellites would be constantly at risk of being hit.
Right.
It could become impossible to launch new spacecraft safely.
Wow.
We could essentially lose access to space for generations.
That is a chilling thought.
It is.
So we've got these really powerful ASAT weapons,
Mhm.
this risk of widespread debris and then this potential for a cascade of collisions that could, like, cripple our access to space.
Right.
So what types of ASATs are countries actually developing, and what are the implications of those?
Well, there are two main types,
Yeah.
kinetic and non-kinetic.
Okay.
Kinetic ASATs are essentially missiles designed to physically destroy satellites.
Okay.
It's like, a high-tech game of orbital billiards,
Yeah.
but with devastating consequences.
Yeah.
A good example of this is Russia's 2021 test of their Noodle system,
Right.
where they destroyed one of their own satellites.
And that test sparked a lot of, like, international condemnation, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like, people were really concerned about the debris field that it created.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not only did it demonstrate their willingness to use these weapons,
Right.
but it also highlighted the danger of debris proliferation.
Yeah.
Thousands of pieces of space junk from that test are still orbiting Earth
Wow.
and posing a threat to other satellites and even the International Space Station.
So kinetic ASATs are kind of like the brute force option
Yeah.
with potential for, direct destruction and these long-lasting debris hazards.
Exactly.
What about these non-kinetic ASATs?
Yeah.
How do they work?
So non-kinetic ASATs are more about disruption than destruction.
Okay.
They use electronic warfare techniques, jamming signals, cyber attacks,
Right.
even lasers to disable or interfere with the satellite's functions without actually physically destroying it.
So it's kind of like a stealthier, more insidious form of warfare.
Yeah,
And it's happening, in the silent vacuum of space.
that's right. And that actually makes it even harder to detect and to attribute and to deter.
Yeah.
It's hard to prove who is responsible for a cyber attack or a jamming signal.
Right.
So that ambiguity raises the risk of miscalculation and escalation.
So we're starting to get a pretty unsettling picture of the potential for conflict in space.
Yeah, I mean, it is a cause for concern, especially with the current geopolitical climate.
Right.
With the U.S. and Russia kind of locked in this tense standoff, and the U.S. and China vying for dominance in the Pacific space is becoming another arena for this rivalry to play out.
So we're not just talking about, hypothetical threats.
Yeah.
Like there's a real potential for these tensions to kind of spill over into space
Absolutely.
with potentially disastrous consequences.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to understand all the different aspects of space militarization.
Yeah.
The weapons, the strategies, the risks.
Right.
So we can have, a more informed discussion about how to manage this increasingly contested domain.
Yeah. You've definitely given us a lot to think about.
Yeah,
I think we've covered a lot of ground, but there's still so much more to explore.
absolutely.
So after a short break, we'll delve deeper into these specific capabilities of these space weapons
Yeah,
and examine the strategies and countermeasures that different nations are developing.
exactly.
So stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive. And before the break, we were talking about the rise of ASATs and the potential for disaster if these weapons were ever used.
And it's striking how even a single ASAT test can cause a cascade of problems.
Yeah.
From immediate destruction to this long-term threat of space debris. It feels like we're playing Jenga in space.
Yeah, it really is a house of cards.
Yeah.
And what makes it even more precarious is the lack of clear international regulations that govern weaponization in space.
Right.
The existing treaties like the Outer Space Treaty are pretty outdated.
Yeah.
They have loopholes and they just aren't equipped to handle the advancements in ASAT technology and the growing number of countries joining this space race.
So we're essentially in the Wild West out there.
Yeah, pretty much.
No sheriff, just, folks with increasingly powerful weapons and no clear rules of engagement.
It definitely raises the risk of miscalculation and escalation.
Right.
That's why it's so important to understand the specifics of these ASAT systems.
Okay.
We talked about the brute force approach of kinetic ASATs,
Right.
but let's look at some real-world examples.
Yeah, so let's get specific.
Okay.
Russia has their Noodle system.
Right.
This is a direct ascent missile designed to take out satellites in low Earth orbit.
Exactly.
And their 2021 test was a big wake-up call
Yeah,
for a lot of people about how dangerous these kinetic ASATs really are.
absolutely.
So what are some other examples?
Well, China also made news with their 2007 ASAT test.
Yeah,
That one created a massive debris field that's still causing problems today.
right.
And there are rumors that they are developing even more advanced systems,
Oh, wow.
including ones that are able to reach those higher orbit satellites. The ones that are responsible for communication and intelligence gathering?
Right.
Imagine if a nation could disable those systems.
So it's a high-stakes game of chess
Yeah.
where whoever controls those satellites
Yeah.
could basically determine the outcome of a conflict.
Exactly.
And the U.S. hasn't done any destructive tests recently,
Not recently.
but they definitely have the capability to do it.
Absolutely.
They've got ground-based interceptors that could be modified for ASAT purposes.
Right.
And they're also investing heavily in laser technology.
Right.
So it sounds like we've got a whole menu of kinetic ASAT options,
Yes.
from missiles to ground-based systems and who knows what else.
Yeah.
But what about these non-kinetic ASATs?
Yeah.
How do they stack up in terms of potential impact?
They can be just as disruptive,
Right.
even though they don't physically blow up satellites.
Right.
Imagine jamming a satellite's communications,
Okay.
essentially blinding it, or a cyber attack that takes over the satellite's control systems, allowing a hostile nation to redirect it or even turn it against its owner.
That's terrifying.
Yeah, it's a serious threat.
How vulnerable are these systems to attacks?
That's one of the biggest challenges with non-kinetic ASATs.
Okay.
They're hard to detect,
Right.
and even harder to prove who is responsible.
So it's kind of like solving a crime scene in space.
Yeah, exactly.
The evidence is elusive.
Right.
The suspects are hard to pin down.
Absolutely.
But the consequences of these attacks could be just as bad as a kinetic strike.
Oh, yeah.
Think about if a nation's GPS satellites were jammed during a military operation,
Right.
or if the financial system went haywire because of a cyber attack.
Right.
Chaos.
And it just seems like with each new technology,
Yeah.
the potential for conflict in space just grows.
So we've got kinetic ASATs,
Yes.
non-kinetic ASATs,
Yeah.
and who knows what's coming next.
It's a rapidly evolving landscape.
It is.
And countries are trying to come up with countermeasures to protect their space assets.
Right.
Hardening satellites to make them more resistant to attacks.
So it's like building a digital fortress in space
Exactly.
that can withstand these new threats.
And nations are also trying to improve detection and attribution capabilities.
Right.
Investing in advanced sensors and intelligence gathering to figure out what's going on and who's responsible.
So it seems like countries need to be able to defend themselves,
Yes.
but also try to prevent a conflict from happening in the first place.
Absolutely.
It's a difficult balancing act.
It really is. We're in uncharted territory here.
Yeah.
The stakes are high.
It's a little overwhelming, to be honest.
Ugh.
We've gone from the excitement of the space race to this unsettling reality.
It is a stark contrast.
Yeah.
And it shows how important it is to be thoughtful and to take responsible action.
Right.
In the last part of our deep dive,
Right.
we'll explore the strategic implications of all this.
Okay.
And talk about how to regulate this increasingly contested domain.
So, welcome back to our final part of this deep dive, and it really has been fascinating.
Yeah.
A little unsettling, but fascinating.
Absolutely.
We've covered a lot of ground from the history of all of this to the really advanced weapons that are being developed.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a scary picture, to be honest.
It is, and I think it's really important now to step back and look at like the big picture,
Yeah.
strategic implications.
Okay.
How are major players like the US and Russia and China viewing space in their military doctrines?
Right. So not just the technology, but how are they using it?
Exactly.
Yeah. What are their goals?
For all three, space is essential for maintaining military superiority.
Okay.
Satellites provide so many capabilities.
Right.
Intelligence gathering, reconnaissance, communication, navigation,
Right.
even targeting for missile systems.
And so basically whoever controls space
Mm-hmm.
controls everything.
It's like having a bird's eye view of the battlefield.
Yeah.
And that's why we're seeing this intense competition. It's
Right.
not just about exploring anymore.
No.
It's about making sure you have access to space and your rivals don't.
And with all the tension between the U.S. and Russia and the U.S. and China, this is getting kind of dangerous.
It really
It's like a new Cold War, but in space.
Yeah, that's a real concern.
Yeah.
The lack of international regulations and the assertiveness of these countries is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, like we were talking about before the break.
Mm-hmm.
Economic disruption, communication breakdowns, that debris cascade.
Right. It could render space unusable.
Yeah, it's a total nightmare.
It is. And this is why we need more international cooperation and dialogue.
Okay.
We need to figure out how to behave in space,
Right.
prevent this arms race from getting out of control.
And we talked about the Outer Space Treaty,
Yeah.
but that doesn't seem like it's really enough.
It's not. It's outdated,
Yeah.
full of loopholes.
So what else can we do to regulate all this?
Well, we could strengthen existing treaties,
Okay.
develop new ones that deal specifically with ASATs and these new technologies.
Right.
We need to ban certain weapons,
Yeah.
have some way to verify and be transparent,
Right.
agree on rules of engagement for military activities in space.
So like a rule book for space.
Exactly. But we also need to build trust
Well,
between all these nations.
Right.
More dialogue, information sharing, cooperation on space-related issues.
So if everyone understands each other,
Mm-hmm.
then maybe we can avoid miscalculation.
Exactly. Like any relationship.
Right.
Communication is key.
And there are examples of this happening,
Yes.
like with the International Space Station.
Exactly.
The U.S. and Russia are cooperating there.
Even rivals can find common ground.
But getting everyone to agree on rules for space,
Yeah.
that's a tall order.
It's going to be incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
But the alternative, an arms race in space,
Right.
is just too dangerous to think about.
Right.
The consequences are too high, not just for those countries, but
No.
for the whole world.
Yeah, a future where we can't even use space
Mm,
because it's too dangerous.
yeah, that's not the future we want.
Definitely not. Well, this has been informative
It has.
and a little bit scary, but we need to face these issues head on.
Absolutely.
So the future of space is really at a crossroads.
It is, and what we do now will determine whether space becomes a battleground or a place for peace and exploration.
Right. Well, we'll leave you with this.
Okay.
As we venture out into space, will we bring our conflicts with us, Or can we find a better way, one of cooperation?
That's a great question.
Yeah, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And please check out the show notes for more information.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Until next time, keep looking up.
This has been another informative episode of Geopolitics Unplugged by Justin James McShane. Be sure to subscribe, like, and share to help fuel us to produce more content for you all.